Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lucy Roche, and I'm a junior sustainability consultant at Turner and Townsend. We are joined today by Natalie Gardner. She is also from Turner and Townsend. The purpose of this event is a retrofit information support and expertise event. So that stands for RISE. We are fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered through Turner and Townsend. Thank you again for everyone who has joined today. And I'll now pass over to Natalie to give our presentation.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm based out of our London office, that's down by Bank, and my projects in housing have predominantly been in the East, Southeast, Southwest. My background's in regeneration of mixed tenure estates, and that's pretty much where I started to learn about developing options appraisals for what is the intervention we're going to be doing on the estate in terms of retrofit, demolition, rebuild, a hybrid of all three. And so one of the factors we always look at, of course, is the additional affordable housing that we can bring to a site, the lower maintenance costs of developing new homes and retrofitting and improving those existing homes, and of course, improved energy efficiency. But increasingly, when we're developing up those regeneration pipelines, we're looking at social factors. And so one of the factors I wanted to discuss today is alleviating fuel poverty. And that is one of the motivations behind retrofit as well. So I think there's a nice crossover there. And seeing some of your names, they're familiar. It'd be interesting also to hear from yourself your own metrics that you use when making decisions about retrofit. And if that does incorporate metrics around fuel poverty, increased well-being of your tenants, and quality of the housing. So today we'll establish a definition around fuel poverty, explore its impacts, discuss ideas about combating fuel poverty, look at the benefits of alleviating that, and then finally look at a practical example in a case study at the end. Now, fuel poverty has multiple definitions. In the UK, we talk about a household being in fuel poverty if it needs to spend 10% or more of its income on energy to maintain a satisfactory heating regime. You might also additionally look at that as being a household in fuel poverty if it has above average energy costs, and if paying those costs would push it below the poverty line. Poverty in itself is relative or absolute as a term as well. So if we talk about relative poverty, that relative poverty line is people living in households with incomes below 60% of the median of incomes in that year. And to give you an idea of what that scale looks like, of what the poverty line scale is, that's looking at about 1 in 6 households in 22-23 who were in relative low income or relative poverty during that period. The last definition on there is a household being considered to be in fuel poverty if it is unable to afford adequate warmth in the home due to energy inefficiency. And I think when we talk about definitions around fuel poverty, it's also important that we start to establish a definition that goes beyond the cost of heating and consider accounting for wider fuel poverty effects, such as the impact on health and well-being. A few more statistics to just frame why we're talking about alleviating fuel poverty today, why it's such a significant issue for our country. The National Energy Action charity, they published a good report. I recently posted about it on LinkedIn, and we'll share it after this call as well. But they estimated that 6.5 million households were in fuel poverty. That breaks down into a few other subgroups we could look at here. If you want to describe the issue being socially unequal, you might want to say that 1.17 million households with children in England were in fuel poverty, or alternatively 2.1 million vulnerable households in the UK were in fuel poverty. Generally, the consensus is here that we have a huge amount of stock that we know is in a poor condition. We understand the factors that can lead to fuel poverty, and we'll cover them again. But the thing I'd like to take away from this slide is that it is impacting those who are already perhaps suffering other social inequalities. And that's why it becomes a priority to couple with retrofit. You notice the language I was just using the slides before, and hopefully I've been consistent throughout the presentation. We talk about households in fuel poverty or people who are experiencing fuel poverty. And when we use language such as the individual is fuel poor, same as if we use an area is deprived, we're overlooking the drivers and not asserting the fact that the house itself is often inherently the issue. So when we look at the drivers for why are we in the state of having fuel poor homes, energy efficiency of the homes is probably that number one factor. The fabric of the building, is it how it's ventilated, how leaky it is with thermal efficiency. And as a landlord, assuming a lot of you here are also joining because you have that duty of care, that ownership over properties, you might notice that those two middle factors, the household income and energy prices, those are further out from your control and your remit. However, energy efficiency of the homes and the energy system that is fueling the estate are those two factors where retrofit can have influence in reducing fuel poverty. I started to touch on it just then when we were looking at the definition, talking about broadening it from the cost of heating and expanding it into including the health and well-being impacts that fuel poverty can have. The impact of quality of housing on tenant health has been recognised since the first Housing Act in 1901. And since then, we've had different funds, including the Decent Home Standard from the Labour government in 2001, as well as the Future Home Standard that should be coming through now or next year, I'm losing track, which will also go towards improving the quality of homes that we deliver for new build. With our cold homes, we see a worsening impact on respiratory conditions such as bronchitis and asthma. And we also see that cold temperatures increase the risk of strokes and heart attacks. There are associated mental health issues with living in fuel poverty caused by financial stress of having to pay increasing bills, but also with the fact that living in colder, damper circumstances does have an environmental impact on ourselves. And childhood development has been flagged as a key area where growing up in cold, damp and mouldy homes with inadequate ventilation has higher than average rates of increasing respiratory impacts in those children at that young age. They're also more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and slower physical growth and cognitive development. And naturally, this then also leads on to having more impacts on nutrition and education for childhood development. Fuel poverty can also have those non-financial impacts that have severe social impacts on households. Mounting energy debts. We saw this a lot during COVID, where some landlords were freezing tenancy or freezing debt on the rent in order to enable householders to pay their energy bills rather than having to make that choice between going into debt with rent, paying energy bills or eating. We also saw during the peak of energy prices during 21, 22, 23, that people may resort to self-disconnecting. So this is where an individual will opt out of connecting themselves to their, or turn off all of their energy to make sure that they aren't consuming it. That choice during the colder months clearly impacts those who might be dependent on energy, either for medical care in the home or already have vulnerabilities and chronic health issues that are worsened by cold environments. Additionally, in the UK, households are burdened by record levels of energy debt, around 2.9 billion. Nutrition and education. This is a field where there's more emerging research around childhood development in particular. I'm sure we've all heard about the phrase of choosing to heat or eat, and families may have to choose between buying nutritious food versus buying cheaper, affordable food. And this is where we end up with this disparity in nutrition for childhoods, for different households with children. This reliance on cheaper food and moving away from less nutritious food leads to poorer health outcomes in the long term. And this is where we're not quite tracking the impact of why fuel poor homes in fuel poverty will have greater impacts on society in terms of the burden on the NHS. Fuel poverty can also impact education. Children living in cold homes are more likely to suffer from ill health, as I mentioned before, but that can also lead to increased school absences. And furthermore, a poorly lit cold home is not conducive to studying. I'm sure any of you who've had to sit down with your school-age child will have known the battle it is to get them to do homework, let alone trying to do that in an environment that isn't conducive to study. Again, in the definition of fuel poverty, and I'm sure you see it when you're choosing your retrofit programs, we're often talking about the cost of heating. We're expanding that out to health and well-being. But within that kind of large number of homes, that 6.5 million are subject to this, there are obviously different vulnerabilities, different issues that are layered within that group. Call it social gradient. So a social gradient of fuel poverty exists, and it's those on the lower household incomes that are more likely to be at risk of fuel poverty. An excessive bill going into debt is then pushing you further into the poverty line, which then has greater impacts on other elements of your life. The fuel poverty gap has unfortunately an ethnic twinge to it as well. So in the 2 years between, I think it was March 2021, the average fuel poverty gap, so this is the reduction in fuel bills needed to take a household out of fuel poverty, It was 36% higher for ethnic minority households compared to white households in the UK. And that already shows you that this is a complex issue that does deserve needing to be looked at in more detail, because of course we also understand that there are already health inequalities for different ethnicities that they experience in the UK too. Certain households are also more likely to be in fuel poverty, including those households on low incomes, but those with dependent children or those with people living with disabilities. And again, it's emphasizing when we're talking about fuel poverty that these are households that might have existing vulnerabilities that could exacerbate falling deeper into fuel poverty. The rates have been rising, and I think that's a really disappointing and shocking fact to see. And so the estimate I've put up on here is by January 2024, so what has already passed, it was 6.5 million households in fuel poverty, not will be in fuel poverty, unless there were preventative actions to go against this. And what I will pick up is that we have been doing consistent amount of work in the social housing sector to improve the quality of our housing, and that is having impacts on reducing fuel poverty, but we've still got a long way to go. Fuel poverty also has environmental impacts. I'll start it with indoor air pollution there. So poorly insulated homes often result in indoor air pollution, which is pretty much the world's largest single environmental health risk. That was identified by the World Health Organization. And you'll see increasing emphasis on getting ventilation correct through the PAS 2035 standard, and increasing prioritization of homes that are having issues with damp and mold. Further, whilst we're keeping our homes energy inefficient, there is energy waste. The housing stock in Europe is much, much better than ours, as we've probably been told several times. And this inefficiency leads to significant energy waste. And as more energy is required to heat and cool these homes, of course, then there are increased carbon emissions, as these homes are generally going to be using either gas, non-renewables, or inefficient systems that will still have carbon emission outputs. If you want to look at the very large scale as well, the impact of fuel poverty is, of course, it restricts our ability to meet our goals to reduce carbon emissions and meet the climate change goals of reaching net zero by 2050 for the country. So if we want to move towards being more proactive and combating fuel poverty, I think we understand enough together in this room why it's important. The average fuel poverty gap, as I said, it was 36% more for those ethnic minority groups compared to white. The fuel poverty gap has increased from £348 in 2022 to 417 in 2023. Just a reminder there of what that means. That is the amount of money you would need to pay to get out of the line of fuel poverty into the green, let's say. Aggregate fuel poverty gap as well has increased overall. So we can see that in terms of the amount of money we'd need to get those households out of fuel poverty, it'd be 1.3 billion. That's up from 2022 from 1.11. And unfortunately, we're seeing with the household composition, those who are greatly affected, it's single parent households were most likely to be fuel poor, and couples under 60 without children had the highest average gap. So that's between them and single parents. We are improving the energy efficiency of homes, especially across the social housing stock. We know that we're able to apply a lot of funding recently over the last years to improve the energy efficiency, the fabric, the heating systems into more modern technologies, take out boilers, and opt for affordable measures that would work for our households, as well as a behavioural change programme that goes hand in hand with doing retrofit and understanding the needs of the tenants so that we can better design those systems in the first place. Now, incomes for low-income households grew faster than the median income in 2023, which has also helped with reducing fuel poverty. And rising housing costs partially offset the reduction in fuel poverty, unfortunately. And in England, fuel poverty strategy is focused specifically on prioritising low-income households for energy efficiency support. So what we're seeing here is that there is a recognition that fuel poverty needs a strategy that is currently being rewritten and devised by the government, and that there is an emphasis on being able to target those households through the funding that's being issued recently, such as SHDF that will come through. And in the past, we've had HUG to the Home Upgrade Grant. Combating fuel poverty over these next few slides will just bring out a few ideas. I think it's a good discussion point as well. So interested to hear what you're doing on your side towards the end of this in terms of targeting your communities and looking at solutions for how you can combat fuel poverty. Of course, we would all love to be able to enhance the household's income to alleviate fuel poverty by increasing their ability to pay bills. In one way, that could be around providing energy management services. That's how I see landlords tackling this one. In terms of reducing fuel costs, policies can be implemented to address high fuel prices, but that could also be, for yourselves as landlords, looking at using district heating and cooling as a means to bring cheaper energy to your estates. Of course, reducing energy consumption by improving the energy efficiency of the building is the main way that landlords are able to look at alleviating fuel poverty. And this can be done through retrofitting properties fabric first, but also looking at those interventions that have an immediate impact on improving the comfort levels for our household. And I have to state here again, it's about improving that energy efficiency. It's going to be about finding the solutions that are right for the building itself, but also understanding the habits of the tenant. And I think sometimes we forget to do that in such detail. So those initial survey works that you'll undertake during the design process, the dwelling assessment process of a property before going into design the retrofit intervention, will also take into account the occupant's behaviour. That's going to be really key for understanding if there's a gap in knowledge about how to use the system or certain demands that we don't see on the surface that they can bring forward and explain how they need to utilise their space for any vulnerabilities they have or any habits that they have with their lifestyle. Other ways of combating fuel poverty that we'll see landlords looking into is ensuring access to renewable energy sources. Some examples of this have been community solar projects that we've seen coming through, where mixed communities have grouped together to invest in renewable energy that benefits their estate. There are other examples of this that we can share at the end as well. But I think that's definitely one of the areas we'd like to see more of across social landlords, is that coming together to create district systems, because we can see that as a way of bringing fuel efficiency and fuel security. Policies that protect vulnerable households from having their energy supply disconnected can also help ensure constant access to heating and electricity. This is one that's probably more outside of the remit of landlords, but it is an important one that needs to be established in government policy, as we've seen that excessive deaths due to cold weather and the inability to heat properties was on the increase over the last years. And as I said, the government is also looking to upgrade the fuel poverty strategy for England, and will be waiting with bated breath to understand what implications that has for how we can deliver retrofit more hand in hand with addressing fuel poverty. I'm going to skim through this next couple of slides, mainly because the benefits of addressing fuel poverty are pretty much the inverse of what we addressed at the start of being the problems with it. Living in cold homes increases the risk of strokes and heart attacks for older people. It increases respiratory diseases, including flu, asthma, and with your more vulnerable tenants who are prone to injuries and hypothermia, you can of course expect that you are going to see improved physical health in your tenants if you improve the quality of their home and make it cheaper to heat. There's also the ability to improve health for children here. So children growing up in these cold, damp and mouldy homes with inadequate ventilation have that higher than average respiratory infections, similar to older tenants who might have risk of ill health due to the colder temperatures. This is a chance for us as landlords and those supporting landlords to address early interventions with children's health through improving the ability to heat homes. I think one interesting thing here that we have is that the healthcare savings that could come from reducing inflammation, from improving physical and mental health issues, have been calculated. I believe, Lucy, just take a note for me that we'll send it around, but there was a cost-benefit analysis done by Christine Liddell, and the analysis identified that investing £1 in improving affordable warmth delivered a 42p saving in health costs for the NHS. It's almost, it's almost half of that price basically being saved. And I think that's really impressive return on, well, it's not quite a return on investment, but quite an impressive ratio for showing the improvement in health. And through doing this improved health, you're having positive effects on vulnerable groups. And ultimately, part of this part of this discussion now about alleviating fuel poverty is also about how do we select retrofit interventions that will have the greatest impact. And one of those ways is to understand that social demographic data when selecting sites and overlaying that in terms of fuel poverty risk with vulnerabilities that are already known about your individual tenants, and creating local targeted groups, targeted action plans for retrofit where you can see you can have the greatest impact. We also need to be monitoring the impact we have environmentally of alleviating fuel poverty. Of course, there's the initial energy efficiency that you'll be monitoring as part of installing any retrofit interventions. You'll be also, I imagine, taking a baseline before any intervention to understand the current carbon emissions and then continuing to monitor that over the first heating season, if not into the first few years, to see that there has indeed been a carbon emission reduction. And during that period of observation, post-retrofit interventions, you'll also be monitoring consumption behaviour. And if you're not monitoring that with a smart system, that's definitely something that can be done through surveys with your residents post-occupancy, we call it post-occupancy evaluation, to see how they're experiencing the retrofit interventions, the new heating systems, the new installation, and see if there is the change that they experience. We call it perceived well-being. And that's a really important one for being able to understand if there has been an uplift in well-being, as well as also getting self-reported statistics on if it has had benefits to being able to pay bills, fuel bills specifically. Other economic benefits we can feel as a wider society is, of course, if we're reducing fuel poverty, that we are enabling income growth from those who aren't then having to spend their money on fuel bills, they can spend it on nutritious food. We are creating, through tackling fuel poverty, it often involves retrofitting homes, so we're creating jobs through this. And by improving living conditions and health outcomes, we're reducing fuel poverty, can also lead to savings in the healthcare system. Money that households save on energy bills can also be spent on other goods and services, stimulating economic activity, specifically in the local area, but also see that as an investment in themselves for satisfaction and well-being. And generally doing those housing improvements, those energy efficiency improvements to the homes, also has a knock-on effect of the next stage of life for that house to attract buyers and make sure that that property isn't stagnating and becoming a relic that has an inefficient system that the tenant can then not sell on eventually. Out of the benefits here, we have a chance to improve the living conditions of our homes. As I've said, reduce social isolation as well through the process of interacting with our homes and our residents and really understanding how they use their spaces during the retrofit process. That's going to be really key to making sure that any measures that are implemented are bespoke and fit for them, as well as the longevity of the building, the house. We're also, through addressing fuel poverty at a macro level, working towards a more equitable society. As I kind of framed at the very beginning, fuel poverty is being experienced by those who are already most vulnerable for chronic diseases or disadvantaged for other reasons, and therefore tackling fuel poverty is a good way that we can focus on being able to lift our homes up into a quality that doesn't leave others behind. There's a case study research done by De Montfort University. Share the link as well in the text afterwards. De Montfort conducted this research into fuel poverty among social housing and the benefits that retrofit can have. It goes through a very extensive section on the definition of fuel poverty that I personally find very interesting, just to shape the kind of language that we use and the emphasis that has on either the resident or on the household or the landlord. One of the terms they had picked out was fuel injustice, and I think that's quite an emotive way to switch the emphasis on who is responsible for improving energy efficiency. That discussion piece then leads into more direct studies on different households and the definition of well-being, perceived well-being, and how we can identify what the benefits are of alleviating fuel poverty. So I think it's one of those academic texts that has some solid points that you can take out of it. It's not too theoretical, and it is a fantastic one just to pull out any key pieces you would like to in building the case for why you should go ahead with retrofit from a social equality perspective. So they conducted surveys, interviews and audits and developed the analysis over summer and winter of the thermal performance of the buildings, but also to understand the experience of the tenants, which of course is also key. It's often credited as being a non-tangible, that experience of those who live in a space. But of course, we know it often has the largest impact on whether they're content with you as a landlord, but also of course, themselves if their well-being is good and their health is good. The findings show that the impacts that retrofit measures can have on a home, and these benefits were also felt by the residents of the home, both physically and mentally. It also concluded how important effective resident engagement is when carrying out these schemes, meaning that through resident engagement, we're able to understand the lifestyles of the residents, as I discussed earlier, but also to understand what the barriers to energy efficiency were, be that knowledge, affordability, or maybe a physical barrier to using a system. Out of the sites that they identified, 87% of respondents reported a level of difficulty paying energy expenses. And this was more impressive when they started to look at what the benefits could be. So through retrofit, energy costs plummeted almost to 10% of what they were. That was a mixture of energy efficiency measures applied to the home. But I'd say that's it's quite a shocking number to see how improved the situation was. The fuel totals, so the fuel usage, also dropped significantly during these retrofit program, and the winter temperatures increased in the homes from as low as 6 degrees to a comfortable 19 degrees. So that's to say that the way the homes were being heated, it was seen that it was more affordable to heat it to a higher level. I think it's a great research piece. We need to be circulating more of this with each other because we need to start building that into case studies increasingly to be able to quantify the impacts of retrofit, not just in terms of carbon, but obviously also the social impacts it has on our residents and their longer term ability to reside in our properties to live healthy, happy lives, but also to be able to pay their rent without stress and not have fuel be an additional element to that stress.